everyone, welcome to the next episode of Talks 21. My today's guest is Daniel Pinchbeck. Hi Daniel.
Hey there, how's it going?
Daniel Pinchbeck is a writer, cultural critic, and system thinker whose work explores the convergence of ecological breakdown, political instability, mythic cycles, and consciousness evolution. Across books such as Breaking Open the Head 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and How Soon Is Now, Daniel has examined whether humanity's overlapping crisis signal collapse or a collective initiation demanding new forms of responsibility, meaning, and social organization. His work challenges both techno-optimism and passive spirituality, insisting that inner transformation and structural change must evolve together.
Hi Daniel.
Karel, great to meet you.
We both talk about crisis, collapse of civilization. What can you tell us about how you see today's world, today's situation?
Yeah, there's so many different elements of that, but I guess in a way, capitalism is a way to think about, humans developed kind of rational, empirical thought, and that led to a kind of materialist worldview and a materialist world conception. And then that sort of turned into a worldview that saw everything in the world as a resource to be exploited for our use. And then that ideology, was very productive and, led to, globalizing the world, building these networks of trade and communication and mining and all of that stuff. But now we've reached a point where it feels like that has to be in its kind of declining cycle. And capitalism can only continue by constantly making new markets, because it's inherently unstable. And those markets have now gone from external markets to markets in the mind. Like people talk about cognitive capitalism. Now they're sort of taking elements of our psychic kind of aspects and turning them into products and selling them back to us. Mm-hmm. A GPS replaces the function of the hippocampus, which is how we learned how to navigate spatially. So children who grow up with a smartphone are never learning how to navigate spatially, so that they're losing some aspect of their cognitive capacity. They're sort of outsourcing it. And now with AI, we're outsourcing our ability to reason and to think logically and so on to the systems of automation. So it feels like, the system of capitalism going through industrialization, post-industrialization, digitalization, biopower, psychopower has now kind of reached its limit, where either we figure out how we somehow turn it in another direction, mm-hmm. or we go into some kind of very deep regressive decline.
Yeah. So part of it is like the manipulation of social networks, how people are being exploited, the data about them, and they are being offered, they want to see. So this manipulation is what you are talking about, that the capitalism actually implies. It's not interest of people, but it is interest of money.
Exactly. Yes. So the tendency of capitalism is to turn everything into a marketable commodity or sellable commodity. But that seems to be reaching its limit now. Mm-hmm. And of course now they're talking about artificial intelligence creating like mass layoffs, and now suddenly the whole discourse is shifting, where they're saying, maybe countries that are homogenous and have a smaller population or declining population are going to be more successful with robotics and AI than countries that are more heterogeneous and have a larger population. So it's quite a situation. And then we have obviously climate change, global warming, uh-huh. the anthropogenic impacts on our environment, the boundaries, the planetary boundaries which we've trespassed. All that stuff we can't even talk about right now because I've got so many other geopolitical crises facing us.
So what you are effectively saying, that the materialistic philosophy approach to life is coming to the end? That we perhaps need to understand that our life is not about material things, but it is more. It is about spirituality. So perhaps the spirituality is the path or the ingredient that needs to come to today's world.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one element or aspect of it. These same technologies which are now being used to control and manipulate could also be potentially use to, emancipate and liberate and create kind of like communities of care and knowledge. And, I find AI really extraordinary.
Yes.
Like I can learn so many things. And so, yeah, but then the other question around, where we go from this point, does involve this question of meaning, or purpose. Because, in the materialist worldview that's been prevalent from, 18th to 19th century until today in the Western world, there's a sense that life is inherently meaningless because we assume that our consciousness is only based in the brain.
Yes.
So as soon as we're dead, there's an absolute annihilation or extinction of any, history and any awareness and so on. Now there are other kind of ontologies which are developing, which would allow for different possibilities and fit more into like Eastern metaphysics, like Buddhism or Hinduism and so on. So for instance, the one that I tend to ascribe to is idealism, or monistic or analytic idealism, which argues that it's much more likely that consciousness is the foundational layer, and everything that we experience as physical and tangible is actually an expression of consciousness or a projection of consciousness.
Yes.
Which is very much how like Tibetan Buddhists talk about the nature of reality and so on. And so that begins to allow for a lot more spaciousness in thinking about purpose and meaning and what our capacities are and so on. So I think that there's idealism, this idea that consciousness is actually the foundational layer. There's panpsychism. Then there's dual aspect monism, which suggests that the physical and the psychic are two sides of the same coin in a way. But these are all, I think, pointing towards a way we can, understand the nature of reality without it just being a physical or material understanding, which sort of leaves consciousness out of the picture. And we've noticed with science, they're always trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness, but they never get there.
Yeah.
And then once you've understood that consciousness is the foundational layer, then there's a lot of other stuff we can look at. Like there's a lot of fascinating evidence supporting reincarnation. There was this guy, Professor Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, who spent his whole career going around the world finding children who had spontaneous memories of their past lives. And he found hundreds and hundreds of these cases. And in some cases, he would meet the kids, hear the stories, and take them back to where they said they were from and find the families that they'd been part of. And, this kid would be like 7 years old, and suddenly he would be like, wait a second, I live in Agra. I have 2 kids. I have a wife. Like, what's going on here? And then they would go to Agra, and they'd be like, oh, this person died, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 2 years before you were born. And then the family would be like, oh, yeah, we feel that this is the person. There would also be birthmarks. So Ian Stevenson wrote a very long book called Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect, where they often found with autopsy reports, there would be significant birthmarks on the kids that matched where the last person had been killed or whatever. So it's pretty fascinating. So, there might be an opportunity for those of us who've developed a sort of rational-minded, skeptical worldview can step back into a mystical or esoteric or consciousness-first understanding in a way that just makes more sense. It's more coherent than the materialist worldview. So I think that's one of the bases for moving forward. And then from that consciousness foundation worldview, then we can understand the religions differently. They all have their place. They represented, the best that a culture could do at a certain time in kind of integrating or assimilating the experience of transcendence or the experience of grace or whatever. But that doesn't mean that they're the final form. That was just what that culture could do at that time, So it allows for more of a sense of evolution of spiritual potential. Yes. So that's the kind of stuff that interests me.
Yeah, what I in the past 21 years ago, I was very skeptic. I was a deep-rooted skeptic, and my argument would be that Occam's razor, the simplest version, would be that things are created randomly. That we have this unlimited number of trials. So anything will happen after sufficient number of trials. So the fact that physical constructs are such a narrow range so that we don't collapse, it's just by chance because you have unlimited number of trials, which is with Stephen Hawking, unlimited spontaneous creation. It's a similar topic. But then I actually had to change my worldview under different circumstances. And what we talked about yesterday, what I'm very happy about, that I found something that I called art in mathematics. So some features or structures in mathematics which are not explainable by pure chance. And this is not part of today's talk, but it is really nice. So for me, actually. After the years that I had to break up my paradigm, my materialistic paradigm.
Which is not easy to do.
Because it's so hard, yeah.
Yeah. And so many people are like trapped in that.
It is scary, right? People are trapped in something they believe, and suddenly something...
Because also we had to do a huge amount of work to get rid of the superstition. Like everybody was like trapped in these superstitions, these faiths. Then we like forced our way out of that. Finally, we were like relieving. It was like relieving to be in the scientific worldview. But now we have to recognize similarly the limits of that worldview and go to the next place.
Yes, that's exactly. Maybe this is good that you pointed out because it's so scary. But it is so important to be able to reflect reality and maybe make a breakup if the reality doesn't correspond to what we believe. We might need to change it. So for me, this was like a big life transformation. And after years, I came to actually kind of the opposite. That now the Occam-Razor argument is that we can do anything.
Yeah.
That we are in a space of, I call it, beyond limit possibilities. That anything can be done with our consciousness, with our will, and.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, I agree. And I also started out as a skeptic. I grew up in New York City, and my parents were artists and writers, but they didn't believe in any metaphysical anything. So it was only when I started studying psychedelics and experimenting with shamanism and visionary plants and had all these different paranormal experiences that my worldview began to shift and change. I mean, I think that's really a crux because, when we look at the sort of the world seems to be moving towards regression and barbarism, and certainly in the U.S. that's the case. And then
not only.
What's that?
Not only.
Yeah, but some of that is like people don't have any sense of meaning or what's the point of life. They're grabbing onto Christianity or some old religion, and it just feels like the wrong direction. Like we need to go forward. We can't just like regress or collapse back, to something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if one believes in the, let's say, spontaneous creation, then logically that's a kind of contradiction with the meaning, right? If it's random, then there is no meaning. Everything will end. On the other side, if once we accept the spiritual chapter or spiritual side of our existence, there is opens the door into belief that there is really a meaning in our life, that we are here for some purpose, and it makes sense to be creative, to do good things, which for me is a great motivation.
Completely. Yeah, and I liked what you said that, when you've had certain experiences, you're like, consciousness can actually do anything. But then we have to figure out, using our rational minds again, with an expanded idea of rationality. How do we do that? So like for instance, like when I was researching, I went to different indigenous cultures, and like in the Amazon and Colombia and so on, and they have their own shamanic and magical practices that work locally, but they're totally different from each other. So I feel that like when you have a indigenous culture that's lived in a place for a long time, and they've developed like a language and a system of meaning and connection to the natural elements in that area, they weave like what Rupert Sheldrake would call like a morphinogenic field, and that allows for certain things to happen. So I think that's maybe how magic happens or how miracles happen. It has to do with a particular like morphinogenic field that a culture creates and kind of like instantiates over time through rhetoric, through practices, through culture, through belief, and so on.
Yeah. The way I see now with extended rationality, actually, I even define like narrow rationality, rational thinking based on the premise of random materialistic evolution, and extended rationality taking into account all these things behind. And in this, if we take it from this point of view, miracles can happen, and they are even rational in the extended rationality, which is amazing, and it gives us this hope. And in fact, for me, it's like not necessarily belief, but a big chance that we are here despite all the terrible things happening, but despite being in dark ages where trust is being lost and people distrust politicians and people are conflict and separated society, then actually it's a part of the great evolution that we need to be in this area of conflict to realize, to be pushed to do something as more conscious people, that we are forced. We are forced to meet together, to discuss, to try to change things. So it's part of evolution.
There's a Diane Fortune, who was like an English magician. One of her lines was, God is pressure. You know? So we're feeling all this pressure right now, like we either evolve or die, we change or we don't make it, you know, and it's quite a precipice in a way.
So it is a big challenge, and so now when talking about it, maybe we can. What are the possible visions for the future coming from now, right? So we can see we have this fantastic technology. So for me, the worst kind of I don't even want to imagine that, but the worst what would be going China way, where technologies, artificial intelligence would control us, and we would be like animals in a cage. So this for me is absolutely the worst.
With a few human overlords who feel that they're like, you know, they've built the technologies, they're getting all the wealth from the resources.
At the beginning, but later they would die, and in the evolution, there will be just technology.
You know, Yuval Harari, I think, has talked about the danger of AI creating unbreakable dictatorships and so on. That's a massive danger, and it's one that people really should understand. You know, including those people who have the power and who are building these technologies should, you know, be understanding that's kind of like the trajectory right now.
It's not even to their in their interest.
It's not to their interest.
Nobody's.
So you know, we can look at a range. I mean, we can. You know, I feel that the most common future perspectives out there right now. One is, you know, this transhumanism singularity idea that, you know, maybe a small echelon is going to become immortal through biotechnology or merge with the machine. So that's our destiny is like straightforward in that way. Then there are people like this guy, Paul Kingsnorth, just wrote a book Against the Machine. And he thinks we need to smash the screens and go back to like medieval, like guilds and so on, craftsmanship. But I think like, the potential is to kind of make use of these technologies to enhance care and knowledge and local knowledge and strengthen the bonds between people and nature.
Yes.
You know? And we don't quite know how to do that yet. You know, we also have to, you know, recognize that these systems we have developed over a very short period of time. I mean, like, you know, the U.S. government, the Constitution, like that was the best attempt that people could make in the 18th century to make something good. I think I was mentioning to you before that I really love this essay by Oscar Wilde, who was a famous like English dandy and, you know, fop and you know, playwright. He wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray and so on. But he wrote a book called The Soul of Man Under Socialism back in the 1890s. And he really saw even then that for humanity to achieve its potential, you would actually need machines to develop to the point where people didn't have to, most people weren't consigned to lives of drudgery and repetitive, monotonous, boring labor, which is where we are now, right? So, you know, he looked at history and said that basically when you look at history, the only people who've really been able to cultivate their unique essence or develop their unique gifts have been wealthy people. Like most of the artists were trust fund kids, including himself, and you know, aristocrats and so on, and everybody else, you know, it's like working in the coal mine or domestic servant or whatever. So it's kind of horrible, you know, in a way. So, you know, there is this potential that we could create a new type of society where everybody was given the opportunity to cultivate their unique assets. Not that everybody's going to become a great artist. Some might be a good lover or just a, you know, family person or a mystic or just, you know, enjoying nature.
I mean, growing grass.
Yeah, for Wilde believed that I mean, I don't totally agree, but he felt that the ultimate, you know, kind of destiny for people was cultivated leisure. To be able to explore whatever your gifts are to the ultimate degree.
And this is great. It was already in the end of 19th century because now it's becoming a possibility. The actually possible. We skip. There is this slave worship alternative. Then of course there can be server. We can destroy ourselves and all these negative scenarios. But now we are going to the positive one, and it is indeed the case that with AI, with technologies, we can have leisure times. We can cultivate ourselves as people. spiritually or in other ways. Now the question is how to do it, how to set the path, because we know that the problem is as people have enough wealth, they become lazy, they degenerate. We know there is this...
well, they don't necessarily become lazy. We have like the super wealthy in America right now are extremely active. They're just active doing terrible things.
Yeah, okay, that's one side. So either or just if there is too much abundance, then it doesn't work. We know there is this, have been done this attempt with mice, right? You would create Eden for mice, and after a year or two, they would just eat each other with total destruction. So how do we cultivate ourselves so that we don't need to fight?
You're reminding me of like George Orwell said that the goal shouldn't be to make life simpler and more complex, but more complex and softer, but harder and simpler. You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
which some smart people figure out when they reach the top, like, oh, I'm going to be like a Zen monk and live in a nice hut on like a mountaintop or something. You know, it's good enough.
That makes sense.
But
it depends. I think it can be subjective. Somebody might be skydiving or whatever.
Or taking acid at the Metropolitan Museum, which is more my type of thing. Yeah.
But the point being that we must always be able to push ourselves to go out of comfort zones, just to experience difficult things, and otherwise life wouldn't be here.
Totally. Yeah, I think that for me, like. What we see in cultures around the world before modern Western civilization or modern civilization is this idea of initiation. You know? And this idea that, first of all, to become fully adult, in a lot of these cultures, you have to go through a process of, entering other states of consciousness, pushing yourself to the limit. Like it could be a walkabout, it could be like peyote, it could be ayahuasca, like you have to go through an ordeal and achieve a visionary state of consciousness where you're not so trapped in your ego. And I think one of the big problems we have now with our leadership is they're uninitiated. So in a way, they're like adult kids. They're like kidults because they've never really examined their own shadow and integrated. They haven't integrated their own shadow material. So they're just projecting their shadow. And most people are also in that condition. So they relate to those people who haven't integrated their shadow or just like projecting shadow everywhere. So, to bring back this idea of initiation.
That's a very important point. Yeah, I agree.
And then beyond that, I think that there's a book I really like called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind by this guy, Tom Roberts. And he proposes that instead of this idea of a technological singularity, we could think about something like a neurosingularity.
Oh, I call today's what is happening, I call it social singularity 21. 21 is the 21st century.
Yeah. But so this idea of a neurosingularity, we would actually use productively everything that we're learning about the body-mind system, neurochemistry and so on. And then people would be able to explore like deeper dimensions of consciousness. And, a lot of people I know, like I have a friend who's done this study in England at Imperial College where they give people IV with dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which at a high dose, this whole reality vanishes, and you find yourself completely immersed in this sort of hyper-dimensional other world where you often feel you're interacting with like beings and so on. And he really believes, my friend who's been funding this, that we could actually make a sort of diplomatic relationships with these otherworld beings and like learn from them and develop a rapport and so on. So there may be, huge dimensions of consciousness that we can explore that don't really involve, all the resources it would take to go to Mars or, build a house on Pluto or whatever. It would be much more about using all these technologies of the self, like shamanism, tantra, meditation, all these ways of excavating more and more of what's the with infinite, or the psychocosmos or whatever, as a possible kind of redirection for humanity.
Yeah, so we need to open, and we are opening the spiritual world and uniting with science. Yeah? Science is important. We need to keep, I believe that science, for me, from early childhood, science was the biggest endeavor of human society, something that we should strive for. Later, unfortunately, I found out how science is being abused also during COVID, and not only COVID. So that's a big problem. But I still believe that we need to embrace science, clean science, and join it and unite it with spirituality. And
Yeah,
doing.
unfortunately, we agree. It makes it less feisty for discussion.
Okay, so maybe to something that we might not agree so much. We are we agree that we are in the phase of collapse of. I probably would say the whole world, because it's just not only Western civilization.
Yeah, but also, people throw around the word collapse a lot. I think that's completely true. But we also have to remember there's all sorts of levels. The worst level of collapse would be, zombie apocalypse, no food, no water, everybody dies. Another level would be like, you can't get an almond cappuccino anymore at Starbucks, but you can still get, a basic level of coffee from the local deli or whatever. So, there's lots of different levels of collapse.
Yeah. So and we are still at the beginning.
Yeah.
What I believe will happen, not quite relatively soon, like in Europe, that we will have outages of power.
It's been happening already, probably from Russian interference.
Yeah, it's actually happening as well. And there are all these bureaucratic issues, like, for example, Green Deal Europe was something totally abused. So we will feel that. And I think it is necessary for people to feel some fears in order to push them for the change. So now, what we might not agree on is the situation here in the US. Because I keep saying that being the current politics like crazy, still it is the alternative. If Biden or the other side was in power, then we would totally, gradually lose everything, lose freedom of speech. So it would be for certain slow path to hell, so to speak. But now we have somebody who's just making throwing big energy, making everything crazy. So it's a wake-up call globally and also locally. And not all the things that the current political side is doing are necessarily bad. Yeah, like concerning, for example, a resurrection of what happened during COVID. I think that was very important, because what we experienced during COVID, it was just such a manipulation by fear. And to me, it was a huge wake-up call, something that is so important that we reflect upon, that we don't forget what we caused to our children. For example, vaccination of kids against COVID is something so evil what happened. Yeah. So this at least gets exposed now. So from here the truth comes up. So that's...
Yeah, well, it seems like it's always a question when we look at society and think about everything going on, how much weight, we give different factors, right? Or things that happen. So for a lot of people, and you included, seem to give like a huge amount of weight to the COVID thing. I don't give it as much weight, because I think there's a history of like, a new disease or virus happens and humanity kind of like overreacts. It's almost like a natural immune system response of the species. And in the past, there often were like forced vaccinations and so on. So, and if you remember when COVID first appeared, there was those Chinese videos that showed people just like dropping dead in the streets. And, maybe those were engineered, maybe the whole thing was engineered, but it created a collective sense of panic. And, there's no doubt that pharmaceutical companies and Bill Gates and so on were, gaining from that. And there's no doubt that it was efforts to test out various forms of technocratic control and so on. And, personally, this is the first time in my life that I feel that my freedom of speech is endangered. I've never had that. Like under a Democrat, I never felt that there was nothing I could say that was going to get me like, in prison. I mean, they've actually said like the co-founder of Palantir joked on Twitter that they built Palantir to kill leftists. Joke. And basically Trump has just issued an executive decree where they've said that if you have anti-American values, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, you can be classified as a domestic terrorist, and then they can use the surveillance apparatus to go after you. And meanwhile, with Doge, they've collected everybody's information into one huge database. And they have your tax info, your social security, your health info. So they have all these tools to go after you. And for instance, like Larry Ellison, who's the CEO of Oracle, who also just bought Paramount, which includes CBS, which was like one of the most premier news networks in the country, and TikTok, which was the major information source for young people, and he's turning those both towards becoming state-sanctioned media. But Ellison is also working with Trump on a $50 billion enterprise called Project Stargate, which is an AI enterprise, which is basically looking at taking everybody's DNA information, genomic data, and having it in one huge database, because that's like a permanent digital fingerprint. Like you can change how you look, but you're not going to be able to change your gene code. But Ellison has said explicitly that his goal is to create a system that keeps everybody in the U.S. on their best behavior at all times. So what does that sound like? It sounds like the Chinese social credit system, but it could even be worse, because actually in China, they kind of care about their people, in a way, like, whereas here, it just feels like, in the worst case scenario, people are just left without healthcare, without social services. I mean, over 1 million people in the U.S. are living out of their cars right now, So that just the lack of any social support is something that I think is just really heinous, considering how much wealth the society has and has generated. But all of that wealth has been pulled up to the top of the pyramid. And then those people at the top of the pyramid are building doomsday bunkers in Hawaii or New Zealand, because they also think it's going to go to hell, even though they're the ones who are creating the hell.
I understand the situation is completely. There are certain catastrophic scenarios going there.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, but going back to the COVID issue, my point being why this was something. First of all, for me, that was the first really situation with total loss of freedom of speech in my country and elsewhere as well. Or those who dared to say something, they were banned and even persecuted sometimes. But just and the thing is, why I don't think it is as any pandemic in the past that people just get scared and stuff, is what happened to our children, what we did to our children. Yeah? Because we knew very soon that the disease was not dangerous for healthy kids, at least. And at the same time, there was this push for manipulation by fears to vaccinate even kids against a disease that's not dangerous for them. Which is something which is like, if you think about it more deeply, I consider this as a cry against principles' lives, because we are hurting our children. I have many kids, I have 5 kids, and like hurting our children, putting their health into risk because of our own fears. That's, to me, it's such a failure. That's comparable to the worst what happened in human history, because always it was a manipulation against somebody. Like people were manipulated against whoever that's evil, and then we could see the Second World War, what terrible things can happen, how people can get out of their brains and stuff. But here it was manipulation against own kids. So parents were scared and they wanted to quickly vaccinate their kids, and it was so irrational. And we knew it. We knew it from the very beginning because kids didn't die, and also we knew that new technology can be very risky. So I believe that it is important for us to do reflection of at this particular thing what happened, to learn from it. Because if we fail to do that, then it could happen again, and we would again systematically hurt our children because of our fears. Then I think that will be a failure. If I were to be a universal judge or something, then I would say, okay, a civilization that is repeatedly making a terrible mistake, like if it should be Holocaust, if it should be systematic things against own children, then it doesn't deserve to be here.
So once again, it's, to me, it's a difference of how we weight certain things. And, when I look at what was happening with COVID, and I'm not, as I said, I don't agree with how it was handled. I just don't think it was as, horrible as you think it was. Because I think, you had a virus that was mutating, and then, kids are always, coughing and going around. And then you have all the old people. So there was like the sense that if you didn't vaccinate kids, then everyone else was going to keep getting it over and over again.
But the kids, their health was not in danger. Yes,
no. But the problem is that the original idea. Anyway, I don't want to. I agree, but I think that there was enough of a murkiness there, and it was like, they were trying to like jam like a square peg into a round hole. But for me, that's only one of a number of factors. But I want to get back to what you were saying about Trump and the destabilization and the derangement. Because there, I think also we do kind of agree that it's interesting, because it did feel like, something, in, you could say, technocracy, World Economic Forum, liberal technocracy, or right-wing authoritarian technocracy. There's an inherent tendency now in the system towards more surveillance and more control, because the technology just makes it so easy. We're all holding the ultimate surveillance device in our pocket, that they can just read us and watch us all the time, whoever the they is or whatever. But so it could be, in the best case scenario, or maybe it's, inshallah, if it's what the divine, consciousness wants to bring into the world, that the acceleration of the destruction is the best thing, because it might wake everybody up.
Yes.
And then we have like a collective general strike, all over the world. We take a month off, and we're like, what do we want to do together, guys? Like, let's figure this out.
Yeah, that's why we are here. We can see the crisis mounting. So that's my argument. If it was the Biden side, it would be gradual decay.
Yeah, I still would have preferred gradual decay, because this is really scary, I find. But but I think maybe you're right. As I said, I'm kind of ultimately a non-dualist, and that I think that everything just kind of like happens in its inherent perfection, like samsara is nirvana, is like the tantric idea. So this is all just happening, and it's as it's meant to be. I sometimes see like the way human society evolves, very similar to like a fetus developing in the womb, where these like different chemical signals, like in the same way capitalism then led to us developing, globalizing the planet, meshing everybody together. So now we're instantaneously connected. Then the way we discovered like LSD in the middle of the Second World War, and suddenly people had these like massive consciousness awakenings, and the spirituality of the East came to the West, and the capitalism of the West came to the East. Like it feels like there's a sort of designed evolutionary process.
Put it all together, big mesh, big crazy pot. And
there's something about it which, whoever it goes, there's an inherent perfection to it.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. And that I believe that if we are, I believe we are the projection of like greater consciousness. So this is a way how to experience, how to live, how to learn so much.
Yeah.
Right? Because we wouldn't be able to imagine what we experience, what we went through in the Second World War, and not only that. So this is this.
Right. Well, that's one reason this happened again, is people lost that embodied experience of what fascism is, and now we're sort of seeing that it's like a cancer that takes over the mind. Where people become totally focused on violence, power and violence. Ruthless violence is what determines who gets to win. It's like when people are just in that mode and there's no reasoning with them, there's no self-reflection, their thinking in a way becomes automatized, and they give their thinking and their willing over to the despot or the sovereign or whatever, in a sense. So that's kind of what's happening, I think, in the US. And the scary thing is that it's very hard to break that. Like we were talking, because then the question is like, okay, we see this incredible potential in what humans could be, and we've kind of now discussed that a little bit as a reorientation towards craft and care and locality and knowledge, and using technology in a more humane way to help people build healthy communities or healthy political structures and so on. But yeah, I lost my train of thought in the beginning, though.
I think what I thought you are going to, you might be going to, is that there is we got totally separated due to the big mesh of putting everything together. Technology separates us even more, and it's becoming so crazy. Now we have no choice to just come back to realize that. Right? If we don't, then we fail, and we might fail. But if we do not fail, then we need to go back. And what this is, for example, what technologies are doing, right? Deep fakes. We know now, and people are not stupid, and most people know it, and they cannot trust anything. Anything that's written, any video, it can all be fake. Like, so what can we trust? We can trust if we talk to each other in person, and if we argue.
Well, you could be a good robot, though.
Yeah, but okay.
And this could be a simulation. I could be like a little pod somewhere.
At least, okay, to some degree, okay, not 100%, to closer to higher confidence, we can trust the personal experience. And this motivates us to come together as people. And suddenly, there is this great motivation and pressure for people to actually come back into nature. To experience that and to start to appreciate that, because they get the touch of virtual reality and stuff. It's not interesting, it's boring. It's much better to be in the real reality on a rock climb on the rock or here, right? So this is something that is pushing us back. So this gives me a great chance, actually. If we don't fail, if we manage to keep our, I wouldn't say even clear mind, but if we manage to protect our freedom of speech.
Well, but I wanted to go back to the how a little bit. Like we're agreeing on like the vision, and then from where we are now, like how do we get there? Because I realized that when I was younger and I wrote my first books, I overvalued reason. So I thought all you had to do was like tell the people the way it was and really make it a good story, and then they'd be like, "Oh, of course, that's the way it is." There is this mystical.
It's logical,
yeah. So then, like recently, I encountered this cognitive neuroscientist George Lakoff, who wrote a book, "Don't Think of an Elephant," and he's basically looking at how the right wing in a way has mastered frames, and so like for instance, you were talking about the deep state before. And so that's like a framing that the right wing has used like over and over again.
Okay.
And it creates,
regardless of...
No, but I'm just using it as an illustrated point, that it creates like a cognitive structure. And Lakoff says that when we get embedded in these cognitive structures, they're hard to disembed, they're hard to get rid of. So language, rhetoric creates these sort of cognitive structures that almost become like physical complexes in the brain. And the right wing has mastered creating these frames. And those of us who want a different type of world in an authoritarian, technocracy haven't figured out how to master that reframing in a way.
Yeah, true. But why did it happen? Well, before that there was this crazy woke activism, right? And it's still in Europe, so it's so totally.
Oh, that was another area where it was nice. We had a little bit of disagreement, which is fun. Because while I agree with you that the woke thing went too far, I also feel that there were like structural injustice and structural racism and structural sexism that had been very suppressed, and people hadn't really had this opportunity to address it. So I feel in some ways it was a natural thing that it started to come up, but then the way it was institutionalized in the universities and in the corporations, and the way it did lead to a suppression. Like for instance, like a white young man, heterosexual in America, was not able to get a book published or to get a painting shown in a museum or whatever. Yeah. So that I think fed the frustration that led to this Trumpian kind of like...
this is overreaction to it.
But I think, culture tends to go like that, like a pendulum swing.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to stop. We need to. Our goal is to stop the pendulum swing or just decrease it a bit. And how to do that? Well, again, it is. I believe it is about consciousness and inspiring people to go into themselves, to go into spiritual world, and to be more courageous, to have more courage.
Yeah, courage is a great thing. Yeah, I think. Well, that's and I appreciated when you gave my little orientation in the beginning. I was like, oh, that was like really well said. Like you really captured some of my ideas. But it's like I think the mistake of the contemporary spiritual world over the last 50 years is people have been focused so much on personal healing, and personal healing is a never-ending journey. We're never going to be perfectly healed. Sure. We're mortal beings. We're fragile. My finger might fall off at any moment, or whatever. Or, your nose might fall off or whatever. Just, we never know what's going to happen. But we're never going to be perfectly healed and whole. So
I'm trying to be perfectly healed. Now my health is ever the best in my life. So.
Congratulations. But you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
So but that quest for this spiritual became like a self-oriented quest, rather than recognizing that the goal of the inner development should then be to support those who can't do for themselves, who to recognize that we are like a human family, and therefore we have to care for those who aren't yet able to care for themselves because of historical patterns of repression or however it's been, slavery or whatever's happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to me, the next step is for more people to be able to find more respect, opposite of the total separatist society, which is we are in the one extreme of total separation. So now we need to be able to understand, at least try to understand the view of other people, why they are where they are, and to communicate with them, and perhaps, the edges make them less sharp. Yeah, that's the way to go.
Right, and to do that, we have to understand, like Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind.
Yes.
And he looked at how conservatives and liberals they weight different things. Like they have a different cognitive structure, in a way. So like for a conservative, like safety and security, those have a higher weight. For a liberal, it might be like diversity or inclusion, stuff like that. So then how do you develop new languages to talk across these divides,
Yeah. So yeah, that's would be my question. How to do that, right? How to make the communication connection, then that even people like Musk, who do have some great ideas, but they are perhaps going to some extremes. So how to communicate with all those people and put them together on the mission of creation, I would say.
We talked a little bit about Musk and Thiel and so on beforehand, and I'm quite fascinated by the trajectory they've taken. The very surprising and kind of in some ways dismaying trajectory. I mean, I think part of what happened with them is they saw early what artificial intelligence was going to do, and they kind of freaked out because they saw that its power was going to be so incredible that whoever had control of it was likely going to be like the ruler of everything, they didn't want China to have that power and so on. So that was one, that's how I think the tech...
Which is a reasonable fear.
Yeah. And then also kind of with Musk, I mean, his... both Musk and Thiel came from South African, like apartheid childhoods. Like their parents were, I think Musk's father was running like a diamond mine, and Thiel's father was the primary engineer at a uranium mine. So they were kind of used to these very stratified societies where you would have a racial kind of underclass. And I think as you get older, some part of you like reverts back to childhood. But then also the problem of people just making so much wealth that they kind of lose, perspective and all these things. But hopefully, I have friends who are working on this. We have to find a way to create a civic discourse where it's like, no, like we can elevate everybody and it will also be better for you, in the long term. Because, like a slave society without freedom is a horrible thing to contemplate for everybody,
Yeah. So what is it that we can do? Let me put it another way. I believe that the essential thing to do now is to help people to communicate, to connect, and to support each other. So those of us who realize that the world really is in crisis, that we need to do something, this is this big pressure, it is our responsibility to pass the test, the civilization test. Yeah. So that's the reason why we are talking. I believe we need to connect throughout the globe, people with good intentions, even though might be different opinions, and somehow find a language to speak and to give each other attention and support.
So right now I'm a big fan of this French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who talked a lot about a lot of the stuff we're talking about in a very highbrow way. So he talks about the Anthropocene, like this massive entropy that's happening with industrial waste and psychic waste. And he believed that we needed to consciously move towards what he calls the Neganthropocene, where we're looking at how we reverse the entropic processes using technology to do so. And he also talks about in this period where we're moving, trying to reverse entropy and create like a Neganthropocene instead of the Anthropocene, we need to become anthropologists, which means kind of like, anthropology looked at all these cultures, but many of these cultures have solutions for us. Like a lot of these indigenous cultures have a lot of solutions for us because they figured out how to live in a reciprocal relationship with land and community for like a very long time. So some of those cultures organized power in a different way. Like some of them had matrifocal systems where, material property and possessions were passed through the female line. And the chief, if you wanted to be a leader in the Lakota society, like a chief, you would actually be the person who owned the least, because it would be a sign of your nobility and your generosity of spirit that you would distribute your goods to everybody to keep everybody whole and connected.
That makes so much sense, right?
Yeah.
And the person who doesn't own anything and is okay with that, accepts this, actually this is the most courageous person in a sense.
Yeah, or the most free.
The most free.
Yeah, because you're not encumbered by, all the different ways that stuff.
I also believe that the future is less and less hierarchy. That we need to become like a flat society
Yeah.
Without like anybody having control.
Well, that's also this Pierre Claust was a French anthropologist who wrote a book called Society Against the State. And he argued that these indigenous cultures had developed intentionally ways of like sharing power. So there, even if there was a chief, the chief couldn't like order people to do anything. They were like the best mediator. It doesn't. We have to break down this hierarchical control structure, which is embedded in our Western systems, and and in China and Korea and all these other places too now.
Mm-hmm. So, if you were to bet, what chances do you give us as human society to make the successful progress for the future?
Good question. I'm feeling more optimistic today for some reason. Maybe because we're in this beautiful ancient land, a sacred Joshua tree. I felt very pessimistic recently. I'm also like I really study a lot of esoteric philosophy, like Rudolf Steiner, he was a Austrian visionary.
Yes.
Who, I think he was born in like 1865. He created his own mystery school called Anthroposophy. Steiner schools for children, but also one for adults, learning about esotericism. And he said that the mission of his life on Earth was to bring reincarnation, the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West. And then not only did people incarnate again and again, and he actually wrote a bunch of books where he would take somebody like Goethe or Karl Marx, and he would show like who they'd been in like the Middle Ages and ancient Greece and so on. But the Earth itself reincarnated. And so we were, for Steiner, we were reaching the sort of culmination of a certain incarnation of the Earth. And then there would be like a regeneration into another Earth where humanity would be reborn in a different level with like different organs and different bodies and so on, So, hopefully we have this amazing breakthrough in this reality and we don't go kaput and we put it back together. But, even if we don't, it might not be the end of the story.
Well, sure, that will be another chapter. We would not making. There are other trials for the global consciousness elsewhere. So it is our responsibility. It's our own interest, and I believe actually, who cares? We should care.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity. It's a good initiatory opportunity. Like if we do it, it's amazing.
And once we do it, I am so much looking forward to it because I believe it will be in our lifetimes. And the next chapter to me would be collective chapter because I'm sure there are other intelligences in the universe as well. So.
Yeah, well, in my book, the 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I studied in great depth the crop circles, these patterns that appear in fields in England. And, there usually people get mocked and ridiculed for taking that seriously. But I ended up pretty convinced that another form of intelligence is communicating with us, here and there with those patterns and symbol systems and so on. And, many people have that experience through psychedelics or even just like, abduction experiences or whatever. So, yeah, I think you might be right that there's a whole cosmos of other forms of consciousness, but they can't really introduce themselves to us until we get our act together.
We need to be successfully born.
Exactly. Yeah, all they can do is give us like these hints.
And it's a very difficult birth process.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's also, as you say, like that's the only way to, the spirit has to be like forged through like, the furnace in a way.
So Daniel, please tell us where can our audience find more about your great work?
Thanks for asking. So there's a number of books. Breaking Open the Head was my first book on psychedelic shamanism. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl was my second book on prophecies, where I talked about crop circles and consciousness and idealism and so on. Then my third book, How Soon Is Now, was trying to figure out how we put all the broken pieces back together and like create like a global redesign. But most recently, I do a lot of work on a Substack, a newsletter, which is just danielpinchbeck.substack.com. So I usually write like 2 or 3 pieces a week. And I also have a course platform where I packaged a lot of the stuff that I think about into these sort of long-form courses, sometimes just with me speaking, sometimes with many speakers, and that's liminal.news, the Liminal Institute. So those are the main avenues.
Thank you very much for this discussion.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Karel. It's great to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah.